It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Jack Goldstone of our nearby excellent George Mason University. He is the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Professor at the George Mason School of Public Policy and an eminent scholar. His work on issues such as social movements, revolutions, and international politics has won him global acclaim and tens of thousands of dollars in research grants. The author or co-author of 9 books, Professor Goldstone is a leading authority on regional conflicts. He has served on a U.S. Vice Presidential Task Force on State Failure and is a consultant to the U.S. State Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. Professor Goldstone today is going to speak on secular and religious cultures in the Middle East, Turkey, Israel, Iran, and the quest for peace. I wish you well.
Thank you, Peter. Look, I have been told to keep this brief because we want to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions. So I've given myself an enormous topic, and I'm just going to be able to make a few comments or reflections, really. I've just returned from spending a fair bit of time in Europe, and I'm quite perturbed at the rise of anti-immigrant populist parties there that are increasing their appeal, even entering governments. And of course, this mirrors the furor that has arisen in this country over the expansion of the mosque and community center in New York, and more broadly concern about immigration that had focused previously primarily on Hispanics, but recently seems to have also extended to anxiety about growing Muslim population. In a way, this is very odd. We've had large Muslim population in the United States for many, many decades. I tell my friends in Europe when I was there that the United States used to have a problem with religious immigrants who were considered very suspicious. Their religious women covered their heads and wore long flowing garments. They followed an authoritarian leader overseas who claimed that the tenets of modernization and liberal society didn't apply to his faith. And these people even were known to give financial and other support to terrorists. Now, these were Catholics, and we had a major anti-Catholic movement in the United States in the 19th century because immigrants were seen as a confounding element in a traditionally Protestant society. And as you may or may not know, there were issues with support for the Irish Republican Army and the conflict in Northern Ireland coming from American Catholics. There were a large number of issues. But at the end of the day, American Catholics not only have become woven into the fiber of American society, they've taken what they've learned back to the source, as it were, and the Vatican II proclamations on religious toleration and pluralism were strongly informed by American Catholic leaders who had learned the benefits of life in a pluralist society. Now, there's been, as you know, enormous discussion sparked by Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations. And many of those who claim to express anxiety about Muslims in Europe or in the United States find justification there. They say, see, there's good academic grounds for pointing to an inevitable clash among civilizations. Well, of course, they do this without reading the detail of Huntington's book, which pointed out not that such a clash was inevitable, but that could well be fomented by those who saw it advantageous to paint the world in those terms. Now, I would agree that there is a clash of civilizations in the world, but it's not a clash between Muslims and the West, or between Chinese and the West, or between Hindus and Muslims. Rather, the real clash is between those who are committed to a view of human society that honors individual freedom and those who are committed to a view of society that focuses on communal obligation and conformity to a communal ideal. Now, it should be said that the belief that societies need to be held together by shared commitment to religion as part of community is a very Western belief. It's not a question of Westerners having a different view. Secularism and pluralism is relatively new in Western history. After all, centuries ago, Europeans burned heretics at the stake simply for professing a religion that went counter to the majority in a given society. Religious wars were fought, and the principle that there should be a national church that dominates a society was accepted almost everywhere. In fact, the United States was founded by people who wanted to get away from being under the control of a national church. And so the United States became the first nation in which the interference of the government in private matters of religion was explicitly banned. In fact, it was the first society to treat religion primarily as a matter of individual conscience rather than as a matter of state concern. Now, that has been a successful model. It has always had to be defended because the view that religion and religious unity is essential to keeping a society stable and united keeps reasserting itself. We hear talk today about Europe being a Christian society and about the United States being a Christian nation. There's, of course, nothing in the founding ideals of the United States that says that. And in many European states, such as France, the current government was founded in opposition to religious domination by the church. It was a very strongly anti-clerical movement, was part of the French Revolution. Nonetheless, somehow, Europeans and Americans have got it into their head that their view of the world is one in which Christianity is compatible with a secular society, but other religions somehow are not. Now, this is, of course, misinformation. Turkey, modern Turkey, was also founded in a movement in part against the authority of traditional Caliph-supported Ottoman Empire, and with the ideal that Turkey would be a secular state. Indeed, Turkey went so far as to make secular Turkish identity the enforced communal glue of Turkish society, carrying it to the point where non-Turkish names and non-Turkish identities were not officially recognized, were believed not to exist. So in the case of Turkey, we have this unusual situation that instead of a state enforcing a uniform religious identity, we had a state enforcing a uniform secular nationalist identity, but still a situation in which the state was enforcing belief. Now, when I think about how can states and people overcome this simple view of a Western versus Islamic clash of civilizations, it's important to recognize that states throughout the Mideast are internally divided on this issue of secularism versus religion. I mentioned Turkey, Iran, and Israel as three examples, but these are not the only countries in which this argument is being fought. Let me just say a few words, again, because we're short on time, about each. Turkey, a country that from its modern foundation at the beginning of the 20th century was avowedly secular, and a country with a long history of religious toleration under its previous imperial administration, is now feared as a vanguard of Islam, potentially a vanguard of Islam in Europe. Now, aside from getting the history wrong, this reflects perhaps the recurrent struggle within Turkey for the reassertion of religion. Because it is a truism that societies have not fared well when they try to ban religion altogether. Human beings seem to need religion as a foundation for morality and social relations. Dostoevsky, I think, was right when he said, without belief in God, it is hard to believe that any act is a crime. But grounding morality in shared religious beliefs in no way prevails against the notion of secularism. Secularism is not atheism. Secularism is not a ban on religion or formal religion. Rather, secularism is the belief that religion is a matter of individual private conscience, and that no individual, and certainly not the state, should ever seek to compel or enforce any particular set of religious views, with the exception that the state does act to limit religious practices that are seen to be dangerous to the broad preservation of human rights. So, for example, religions that claim that they might want to accept slavery because it is supported traditionally in the Old Testament, or polygamy, would find those practices still banned by secular law, where that law argues that this is necessary to provide support for fundamental human rights. But the broad principle is individual conscience is what we protect. This is a form of individualism. It's the kind of Western rationalist individualism that did emerge from the Enlightenment, but it's an argument for individualism not as greed, not as selfishness, but rather for the absolute value of every human being and the right of every human being to have freedom of their conscience in how they pursue their religious beliefs. Now, I think that belief is what is rare and disappearing in the world. We find, whether it's in Europe or the Middle East or in the United States, increasing anxiety that other religions are trying to impose their will on us. So in America, a lot of the concern about Muslims is that they're going to impose their law or their way of life somehow on America. In Europe, there's these hysterical anxieties that Europe or European cities are going to be transformed into bastions of traditional Muslim law, even though the voting population of Muslims can't possibly increase to more than 15 or 20% of the population, even with another 20 or 30 years of rapid migration. The numbers just aren't there. But the anxiety of forced and imposition of conscience is real. Now, Israel faces this problem because Israel has believed in the right of individuals to choose their religion. And so there are secular Jews, there are religious Jews, there are ultra-Orthodox Jews, there are Muslims, Arab and non-Arab, in Israel. But what has happened in Israel that no one expected is that the number of Orthodox Jewish adherents has grown enormously, from less than 5% at the time of the founding of the Jewish state to 20% or more today, and under current demographic trends, perhaps 40 or even 50% in the near future. Now, this is unexpected and in many ways a problem because the ultra-Orthodox do not recognize the same rights of individual choice and conscience as most Jews around the world. They still deem that marriages that are not carried out by Orthodox religious authorities are not valid. They still argue that Jewish descent through the mother's line is critical, if not, one only recognizes conversions through very traditional Orthodox practice. And they claim that the rights of secular Jews to deviate from Orthodox practice is not going to be honored in domains where they dominate. As long as they were a minority, it wasn't a great problem, but they're now numerous enough to affect Israeli politics in a large way. And the issues of whether Israel will remain a secular state, not whether it'll be a Jewish state or not, which is problematic or not, but whether it will be a secular state or not is going to become a major concern. Iran is the last country I want to mention. As many of you know, there's a very large Iranian population within the United States. Washington's a major center, Los Angeles as well. And most of the Iranians that you probably know are very secular, modern people with high education, high rates of professionalization. And this is true to a large degree within Iran as well, which has one of the highest rates of women's participation in higher education and professions throughout the Middle East. Has one of the lowest rates of fertility, very international outlook, and yet the government of Iran professes to claim a very strong right to impose a particular religious allegiance within its society, and particularly to adopt a very hostile attitude toward Israel and toward Western nations who it sees as trying to keep Iran down. Now, Iran has had multiple identities over the centuries. It has had a strong Shiite identity only since the Middle Ages. In modern times, the Shah tried to revive a strong traditional Persian identity, drawing on history for thousands of years, including many, many centuries that predated Islam. And so when one asks, what is Iran's identity? Is it a secular nationalist identity based on Persian history and the great achievements of Persian science and poetry and the arts? Or is it an Islamic identity based on the Shia identity that was developed in contradistinction to the surrounding Arab world? This is still a very open and unresolved question, but it is a question that is now being fought, as it were, a battle in the streets, because the principle of individual rights to vote and individual rights to express criticism and views about the direction of Iran's foreign policy and religion has now been taken under control by a rather strictly repressive government, one that's grown far more repressive in recent years. I will close by saying I don't know how one can revive the view in this conflictual world of individual conscience as primary. But I do think the only way to get past these anxieties and fears is for Islamic leaders, Christian leaders, Jewish leaders to stress that what we all have in common at the beginning of the 21st century is a belief that societies have worked best and been most creative and most productive when religion has been treated as a matter of individual private conscience, and the rights of individuals to determine their own faith and practice is defended, not attacked, by the state. I believe that's the message that will reassure people in Europe and America if they hear it from Muslim leaders, and I hope it's a message that will lead to greater peace in those countries in the Middle East that are now being internally torn apart by arguments over whether they should, in fact, be secular or religiously dominated societies.
Well, thank you, Dr. Goldstone. That was
did we make it in reasonable time?
Quick.
Yes.
I would prefer to open the questions, and if you lag, I certainly have a couple. Ma'am. Yeah, please wait for the microphone, and why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure,
too?
yes. My name is Alev Akbulut, and I have one quick question. I'm trying to see what role the media plays in all of this, because I was just telling the lady that even people like myself, like even I know better, whenever I think of Iran, Ahmadinejad clicks on my mind. And the same thing with, as soon as you talk about Israel, it's a Palestine-Israel conflict. It's like the media is not, first of all, doing a job, and I'm wondering how we can change it. Is there not enough interest? I mean, people like me, I'm looking, but I have to search. I have to put so much effort to change my mind, to educate myself, And there's only so much that I can do. But then again, as soon as I turn off on the TV, which I usually don't, you see the same images, and then that just does more to you for some reason as a human being. And second, my biggest concern, besides from stuff is happening in Europe also, it's very complex, but also like the discussion that we just recently had in the US, Mr. Obama being accused of being a Muslim. I didn't know that it was such a big deal. First of all, I thought that we were so free and we didn't care, and then all of a sudden this discussion again. I understand people's fears, but us, we're asking those ignorant questions, and then telling everybody that we're the example, follow us. Asking the President of the United States such a ridiculous question, which he isn't a Muslim, obviously, and even if he was, who cares? So what is going on in the US as well? And are we being a good example, or what's going on?
There are two different things here. When you talk about the media is not a single united group, right? In fact, it has splintered beyond recognition. I was talking to some friends about this. If you're old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, he was a voice that people trusted, and a very centrist and moderate voice. When there were only three or four television networks, and shows tried to get an audience of many tens of millions, they aimed for a broad, centrist, reliable view. But the media is now fractioned into dozens, if not hundreds, of channels and blogs, each of which is quite happy to have an audience of hundreds of thousands or a couple of million. And they allow people with far left, medium, far right, everything in between, to each find media that reinforce their own views, that don't move them toward the center or challenge them. So that's a problem, and I don't think there's much that can be done about that. What I do think is that there's far less excuse for religious and political leaders to adopt an inflammatory view. The mosque in New York was not controversial until political leaders took it upon themselves to say, maybe this is something that would upset people, it upsets me, and I'm going to make a crusade about it, a campaign to mobilize people against Muslims. And that's literally what happened. And it is very worrisome to me because the coverage split again very rapidly. A lot of people simply joined in. And it's a very odd thing. I mean, if you say, yes, the people who were on the plane in 9/11 who crashed into New York, they were Muslims, but 19 out of 20 were Saudis. And we don't focus our anxiety on Saudis. Why do you blame all Muslims for something that was carried out mainly by Saudis? It wasn't even all Saudis. I mean, it was mainly a small group that had been brought together in Germany. So how we label this group or that group is something that the media, I agree, is involved in, but it's not just the media. It's religious leaders and political leaders who have been, I think, willfully irresponsible in trying to take advantage of potential conflicts and anxieties. There's no reason that Americans should ever have been given this broad, vague, undefined view of Muslims unless it was done by people who were deliberately using that word in a provocative way. Because America is full of Lebanese and Syrians and Iranians, and people know them as such, and the fact that they're Muslim is almost incidental. It's just a part of their identity. So again, why we focus on these broad labels instead of individuals who act well or badly, that's something we have to focus on. Maybe we should hold the media and others more accountable.
Do you want the second part?
Which was
how are we doing? Do you want to elaborate on that at all? Elaborate on America's report card. Is that fair enough?
I don't even want to go there. It's a political ploy.
Okay. You had your hand up, sir. Keep it.
Thank you. My name is Mehtab Karim. I'm currently working on World Muslim Demographics at Pew Forum. I have a question which relates to your question, but more broader terms. I was raised in Pakistan. I came here in the 1970s as a student, and I found out that this country would welcome, especially people coming from different cultures. But what we know now that the things have turned around, perhaps 9/11 or even before. For my work, I have traveled widely in many Muslim countries, and I'm seeing the same thing in those countries, that they're becoming less and less tolerant, whether it's Iran or Pakistan, where the regime came from, or Indonesia, or even Turkey or Israel. And you know what Dr. Goldstone mentioned about the demographics of Israel, that the people are becoming more conservative, religious-wise. Where do you see this is going to go further? Because media is playing a very major role in that. To end my comment and question further, that it was New York Times, the most liberal of the liberal newspapers around the world, which broke the story of the Ground Zero Mosque. And the story is that they started it, they initiated it, and we are where we are on that issue. So where do you see this media is going to take people around? And even in the countries which our newspapers are not read much, in many Asian countries, is the television, which is causing this revolution in the thinking of the people. So that's my question.
Well,
thank you.
Of course, I am worried that what we're seeing in Islamophobia in the West is mirrored by growing suspicion and hatred of Western countries in the Islamic world. Essentially, the discussions are going on without an awareness of the fact that the whole world is listening. I spoke to a Swiss journalist and I said, you know, it looks very bad for Switzerland to have banned minarets. What was the point of that? It was a play for local Swiss concern, but it's resonating throughout the world as an attack on Muslim way of life. And the reporter from Switzerland, he said, really? You mean people outside of Switzerland have paid attention to that? And I said, yes, it is picked up and reported, and it is turned around and made very unpleasant throughout the world. And he didn't seem to recognize the degree to which media is globalized, and the things that we say to ourselves, sometimes even in private, get picked up and amplified and spread. So I'm very worried that if communication takes the form of we complain about what we're worried about, and Pakistanis complain what they're worried about, that American drones are killing their women and children, we're going to have more and more hatred. And I tell people in Europe and the United States, hold on a minute. If you look at where we're going in terms of Muslim population, there are going to be 1 billion more Muslims in the world in 40 or 50 years than there are today. There are not going to be any more Europeans and very few more Americans. This is not a fight that you want to get into. This is a fight that we need to end as soon as possible. But it could go badly. What I hope is that people in Europe and America, particularly economic and political leaders and business leaders, will say, we've been very successful in extending our lifespan and in reducing family size so that you have a life that you have chosen with few children and a long life. But our economies are now going to slow down because of those choices. If we want to continue to have economic growth, we're going to have to increase our trade with foreign countries, with Turkey, with the Middle East, with India, with Indonesia. If we don't get involved in trading with these countries, where will we get growth? And so I hope that will motivate people to say, maybe we need to be more careful and build more positive relations. Now, I'm also happy to say we get lots of students, lots of professional visitors from various countries. We have research centers now that have really increased in number. George Mason, my university, just received support for a Center for Turkish Studies, in addition to our Center for Islamic Studies. So I think people will learn more about this vague other, and that will help. But we do need leadership to push that forward.
Let's try a non-media question. This lady here. Wait for the mic, please.
Hi, thanks. My name is Rachel Streitfeld. I wonder if you can delve a little bit deeper into the dynamics of Turkey. I haven't read as much in the news as I probably should have about the tensions between an increasingly Western-looking secular population that enjoys the bars and clubs of Istanbul and they want a life of freedom versus a growing sense of obligation toward God and community, and a rising prevalence of religious people in Turkey, and what does that mean for spheres of influence, right? Accession to the EU versus Turkey increasing its ties with Iran and support for terrorists and these types of things.
All right. It's a very good question, because we do see an increase in the number of women wearing headscarves. We do see an increase in support for the AKP, which is a formerly moderately Islamic party. What does it all mean? Well, let's put it a little bit in historical perspective. The United States has had periodic religious revivals, Great Awakening, religious festivals, and our business community was powered by what Max Weber called the Protestant ethic. Pious, hardworking, sober, disciplined people from small towns starting businesses, saving and investing their capital, and seeing success in business as a virtue, along with membership in their community church, contribution to charities, and the like. Now, we accept that as, of course, well, that's American history. American history is motivated by interest in business, Protestantism. But what's happened in Turkey is that the secular government that I mentioned as having been responsible for founding the modern regime was more influenced by large landowners and the military than by commercial and business interests. And for a long time, those interests kept a fairly firm grip on Turkish government and society. But in the last few decades, pious Turkish businessmen from the center and eastern provinces have been increasingly successful, founding businesses, trading in Europe, trading in the Middle East, and they've increased in their numbers and their financial success and their influence. And they have supported parties that, yes, on the one hand, responded to their greater traditional pious beliefs, but also responded to their interests in international trade, better communication with Europe. And so it's kind of an interesting conundrum that the AKP, although it's the party supposedly of more Islamic religion, not secularism, it's also the party that's more in favor of EU membership and following the rules of the European community with regard to human rights. Whereas the secular traditionalists were more allied with the conservative landowners and wanted to keep a more top-down hierarchical control of Turkey, and were, frankly, less concerned about human rights issues. So what's happening in Turkey is much more complicated than a simple religious revival or increase in religious politics. There's a new book coming out by a student I worked with who argued that the rise of religious politics in Turkey was really a response to the excessive strictness and repression of the secular government, which really was not living up to the desire of Turks to get greater opportunities in the global economy. So I think we need to look at what's happening in Turkey and say they're interested in supporting human rights, they're interested in working more closely with Europe. They recently had a referendum to try and expand the rule of law and limit the influence of the military. These are all things that Europeans and Americans have thought are good. And the fact that a lot of this movement is being supported and moved forward by pious business people, we should recognize that's exactly what happened with our country too. And that's not a bad thing either.
That's awesome.
Okay. This gentleman on my left.
My name's Dan Lieberman. Yeah, to get more specific, we're concerned about religion as promoted by the government. Now in Israel, as you mentioned before, a Jew cannot marry a non-Jew in Israel. As far as education is concerned, you have to serve in the military to get a scholarship, and it's very, very difficult for Arab people to serve in the military. Also, a non-Jew cannot buy land in Israel. Now, is this true also in like Iran and in Turkey? Do they have similar laws to that?
I can't speak to what's going on in Iran today with regard to property law. I simply don't know. And I would imagine it's changing in ways that are hard for outsiders to tell. In Turkey, there certainly were very strict limits under the early secular government of what, for example, Bulgarians could do, and basically anything that was seen as deviating from Turkish identity, whether it was the aspiration of Kurds or other minorities, was suppressed. Now, a lot of those laws are still on the books. There is still a lot of dangerous conflict, particularly with the Kurdish minority, that raises great concerns about how much of recognizing Kurdish aspirations is giving people freedom and how much is giving in to terrorism. And that's a very complicated issue, and I don't want to try and tell you what Turks think, because opinion is very divided on this issue in Turkey today. But I will say that the current government has made efforts to try and recognize a role for non-Turkish ethnic groups in Turkey, and to give them the opportunity to hold on to their own non-Turkish identity, culture, and language, and still participate fully in Turkish society. It's very far from having been fully established or working, but that is the expressed aspiration of the current Turkish government.
Next to him, Father. The mic.
My name is Father Avelino Gonzalez. I'm from the Archdiocese of Washington, the director of the Office of Ecumenism and Interreligious Dialogue. If I understood the thesis is that a secular government or culture is a solution to the interreligious tension in the world today. And I'm not sure how that thesis can be placed forward based on the history of the 20th century. There was a comment made that secular does not mean atheist, but in practicality, we've seen that to be the case. And we see that given the Soviet Empire and other totalitarian systems who have been secular, atheist, totalitarian systems, that has been the greatest cause for bloodshed in the history of humanity. I think there's a narrative, there's various narratives that keep on popping up in society and in culture. One of those narratives is that religion is the evil of the world, and that as long as you place religion in a private realm and you completely obliterate it from the public forum, that somehow everything will be fine. I think if you pull the string on why there is a reoccurrence or a revival, not just in Israel with the Orthodox Jews, not just in Middle Eastern countries with Islam, but also in Christian sectors, is because the void and the vacuum created by a secular culture does not answer the most fundamental questions of the human heart. And so there's now, we're seeing people hungry for something spiritual which is not there, which causes an incredible dynamic also in society too. Not to belabor the media issue, but the question I always ask is, why is it that a small church in Gainesville gets international publicity? Surely there's a lot of, you know, radical religious out there, but none of them are getting international publicity. And so there's a narrative, a secular narrative, and a worldview presented by the culture and the media that, in my mind, is kind of putting these conflicts on more relief. Do I have a question? The question is, I guess, based on all that, how is it then that there's more accountability? Because there's all types of dialogues. This is one of them. What can we do to get that dialogue, interreligious dialogue, in the front pages, as opposed to one pastor in Gainesville that's burning the Quran?
Well, I think there the question you raise really is, what is the source of faith and how is faith sustained in a supposedly secular modern world? Doesn't indeed modern secularism tend to drain away people's support or belief in religion, and isn't that dangerous? I think it would be dangerous if it were true, but historically it is not, in fact, the case. For example, in France, even though the French Revolution was very strongly based in anti-clerical belief and resulted in the French government taking over the Catholic Church and all its properties in France, there was a revival after the Revolution in the 19th century in Catholicism in France. There was a revival of faith. It didn't result in the government becoming a Catholic government once again. It resulted from the government remaining secular, but the population embracing its faith. Same thing is true in America. In America, the principle that the government should not interfere with the practice of religion did not in any way reduce the enthusiasm for religion by Americans. However, the principle of secularism made it possible for Irish and Italian and Eastern European migrants to this country to continue to practice Catholicism rather than be told, if you want to be an American, you have to be a Protestant. You have to convert to our American faith. It was debated, it was argued when John Kennedy ran for the presidency. It was argued, could this country tolerate a Catholic president? What about the mixed loyalties to the Pope? And Kennedy argued, and it was accepted, my faith is a private matter. It doesn't interfere with my allegiance to the American government or people. Here in Fairfax, Virginia, we're in Washington, D.C. right now, but across the river in Fairfax, we had an Episcopal church whose followers were upset by patterns in the leadership in the Episcopal church and decided they would rather affiliate with a church in Africa that they found more congenial to their beliefs. Now, you cannot imagine any, say, city in the United States saying, we don't like the government in Washington, so we're not going to recognize that government. We're going to proclaim our loyalty to a government in Africa because we like their beliefs better. They'd be considered traitors. It would be, completely beyond something that we would tolerate. But in matters of religion, because it's a matter of private conscience, it's okay. That's what I think secularism allows, and it actually gives greater vigor to religion when you allow people to follow their faith.
Sir, please wait for the mic.
Stuart Schwartzstein. Your mention of European history made me think of persecutions, religious persecutions in Europe. And I think it's fairly clear, and I think most historians would agree, that underlying many of those persecutions were economic determinants. Think of the Templars, think of the Albigensians, the Jews. Now, to what degree and in what places might religious conflict currently be attributed to economic determinants?
Well, you're quite right that religion always tends to get somehow intermeshed with economic concerns. In fact, where political pluralism did emerge in Europe, in Prussia, in the United Kingdom, it wasn't just a matter of allegiance to a philosophy of pluralism. It's because certain rulers in Europe said we would benefit from having more Jewish bankers or more merchants, and we're going to take advantage of that. If those Spanish or French are going to kick perfectly good, productive people out of their country on religious grounds, we're going to welcome them to strengthen our economy. So it's always been the case that concerns about religious purity or belief have somehow gotten involved with what's the payoff going to be for me or my country.
But there has been payoff in persecuting.
And when there has been payoff in persecuting, it has often occurred. Henry VIII, who had been a defender of the faith, made a lot of money when he parted with the Catholic Church and seized the monasteries. Now, in America, we've had, as I mentioned, cycles of religious awakening and cycles of paranoia and anxiety. And it is generally true that economic downturns make people more nervous about outsiders, more anxious about people with different beliefs, because people are worried that the economy is somehow turning against them, they're losing what they had counted on, and now we somehow can only strengthen ourselves by putting faith in family, those we know, those we trust. That's our source of security when economic security is taken away from us. And so we are seeing that. What is difficult now, and this I think is a message that our economic and political leaders are not getting across to us, is that in a world that depends on international trade in goods and services, it's not the case that there's security to be found simply in holding to your family and the people you know. It's not. I had this asked to me by someone who was concerned about unemployment in a town in England. They said, we've got a lot of unemployment here. We've had a lot of Muslims who came to work in factories. Now the factories are shutting down and everybody's upset. And what I said is, look, if the factories are shutting down because they're not competitive, it doesn't matter who's living in the neighborhood. Everyone is going to lose their jobs. And changing the composition of the neighborhood won't matter. But if the factories are competitive, if people are producing goods and services that are wanted in the world, again, it won't matter who's in the factory and working. Everyone will do well. So the problem we face is, how do we keep people educated, productive? How do we get the banks to lend? How do we get factories refitted with products for the growing markets in Latin America and the Middle East? Those are the issues that will give us economic security. Changing who happens to be living next door or working in your neighborhood or worshiping down the block, none of that is going to save your job or help you in the world that we're in now. And I think that's a message that we need to make clear. We're all in this together. If America becomes more productive, all Americans will benefit. That's what we need to accomplish.
Sir, in back.
Thank you very much. My name is Albert Nikemkin. Thank you very much for your comments about the development of the new Muslim majority in Turkey that by and large supports the current AKP government. As you were speaking, I was recalling that since the foundation of the Turkish Republic, there has been a very strong effort to reinforce the Sunni establishment. As most of us know, the government pays the salaries of imams, it pays for the building of mosques, etc. However, recently there's been a lot of unrest in Turkey between Muslims. There was a march of 1 million Alevis, for example, insisting they need their rights too. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how to promote more tolerance within Muslim societies?
In some sense, there's no need to talk about promoting more tolerance within Muslim societies, because many Muslim societies are reasonably quite tolerant. So Indonesia has a very kind of fairly easygoing, flexible Islamic faith that's kind of melded into a national unity government. Historically, Turkey and India both had periods of great multicultural flourishing under tolerant leaders, although they did also have periods of harsh reinforcement of Sunni orthodoxy. Countries in North Africa, again, have varied over time. So the question, I think, is not whether Muslim societies need to become more tolerant. The real question is, in many Muslim societies today, perhaps all of them, there is a battle between moderate democratic forces and more extreme fundamentalist forces that see a threat from secularism or tolerance of Western or even Muslim minorities. After all, the conflicts between Shia and Sunni that are occurring in Iraq, but also in many other states, are fraternal conflicts within Muslim societies over what modes of Islamic worship are to be recognized as reasonable and legitimate. Again, I would say in the current global economic downturn and after the emergence of the conflict in Afghanistan between communists and mujahideen, the Iranian Revolution, in the wake of all these events, there has been a reinforcement of the belief that communities have to enforce some orthodoxy to make them safe. And I think all societies need to recognize that that's a dangerous illusion and to focus more on the need to protect individual consciousness, freedom, and creativity as the way to move forward.
Gentleman in back.
Al Milliken, AM Media. I was curious, how do you see the military alliances affecting both secular and religious thought? I'm thinking in particular, I was interested in how you view Turkey's participation role in NATO, but also going back to the United States support of jihadists like Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. How do you view these developments?
Well, when I travel around the world, one thing that I'm often struck by is the degree to which people outside the United States think that because America is a rich and powerful nation, everything we do is part of some great coordinated plan to establish our power and achieve our goals. And it's true that we have military bases in over 100 countries around the world, and we've become engaged in lots of ways in countries that seem as if, oh my gosh, what is the US doing here, there, and everywhere? And the hardest thing for me to explain is that leaders of America are flawed human beings who make mistakes and who often do things that lead to outcomes or consequences that they hadn't expected and didn't want. That we're really not in control any more than anyone else is. We are just trying in many ways to do something that works, and often it doesn't. So when the United States gave support to anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan, it wasn't with the idea that we were going to raise extreme jihadis. What we did is we kind of abdicated to Pakistan and said, you know, Americans, we don't really understand Afghanistan. We don't know what's going on. We do know that we want to get the Soviet Union out. So we're going to give money, and we're going to let the Pakistanis decide which groups get the money, because after all, you guys are right there. We'd been working very closely with the Pakistani military over previous years, and so we said, you guys do it. We did not expect, know, or frankly even understand that the Pakistanis saw their best long-term interest in maintaining strong influence in Afghanistan would be to support the more radical Islamic groups who they felt would be much more dependent on Pakistani support. precisely because they weren't the most popular groups in Afghanistan. So we ended up, without planning to do it, to create a lot of strength for extreme radical Islamist groups in Afghanistan, and we're still trying to sort that out today. We entered an alliance with Turkey in NATO because it was essential to protect that whole Middle East region from potential Soviet aggression, just like we did with the NATO countries in Western Europe. Now, at that point, we didn't pay much attention to what was going on in terms of human rights or other issues in Turkey, just as the United States during the Cold War supported a lot of regimes that had terrible human rights records because it was felt necessary as an expedient to try and block the expansion of communism. And we now have the result that we supported a lot of very bad regimes and earned the enmity of a lot of people around the world with whom it would be much better if the US were friends. But we made mistakes in the Cold War that we're still, in a sense, paying for. So I do think one has to say, if you look at the history of United States relations with Muslim countries, the US has been very close and very supportive at different times of countries like Morocco, Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia. But if we have made mistakes and done things that often worked against the interest of peace or against the interest even of the United States, it's because we didn't have a plan when we did all these things. We kind of were reacting to the Cold War, and then we were reacting to the end of the Cold War without having a clear vision of what we should be doing going forward. And so now we're struggling. What should we do? Should we say we've got to pull back? Should we, disengage from Muslim countries, or should we be more engaged and try and advocate for our values of democracy and human rights?
I was really interested in more how you see Turkey and you see the jihadists.
Turkey,
how they're viewing those military partnerships.
Unlike Saudi Arabia, jihadists have never treated the alliance of Turkey with NATO as a reason by and of itself to attack NATO. Turkey is not considered sacred ground by Sunni believers in the way that the holy cities in Saudi Arabia are. As far as Turkey's role in NATO, it could be magnificent. Turkey could be the ultimate bridge between Europe and Asia. And Turkey, for its own interests, must be engaged with both Asia and Europe because it has important markets for exports and goods and services and communications on both sides. You can't expect Turkey to be other than engaged in both directions, which could be a great asset. On the other hand, it does provoke paranoia in both areas. Certainly a country like Iran looks to Turkey as, you can understand us and support us, but so also does Israel look to Turkey as a country and say, you have understood us and supported us. So Turkey has this wonderful advantage of a deep history with both Europe and the Middle East. But does that leave Turkey as a target of suspicion by different countries? Yes, at various times it does. But this is a problem for Turkish politicians, and it's something where I hope Europeans, Americans, and even Israelis will understand the complexities of Turkey's position and work to make that something that enhances communication across societies.
Well, Professor Goldstone, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of what I have considered a very stimulating discussion. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for all your great questions.
Thank you.